From the earliest years of the nuclear age, the United States quietly confronted a category of danger that sat uncomfortably beside public narratives of control and deterrence: the risk that nuclear weapons could be lost, damaged, or nearly detonated not through enemy action, but through accident, miscalculation, or routine operations, a risk formally designated within U.S. military terminology as broken arrow incidents. The term referred specifically to accidents involving nuclear weapons that did not pose an immediate risk of nuclear war. Yet, its existence revealed an implicit admission that the everyday management of nuclear arsenals carried hazards severe enough to require their own classification, procedures, and secrecy. These incidents emerged as an unavoidable consequence of the Cold War's central logic, which demanded that nuclear weapons be deployed widely, handled frequently, and maintained at high readiness across land, sea, and air, embedding extraordinary, destructive power into routine military practice. As the United States expanded its nuclear forces during the late 1940s and 1950s, weapons were transported by aircraft, stored at dispersed bases, loaded onto submarines, and integrated into bomber and missile systems designed for rapid response, creating countless points at which human error, mechanical failure, or environmental conditions could produce catastrophe without any hostile intent. Broken arrow incidents therefore represent a hidden history of the Cold War, one defined not by confrontation between superpowers, but by the internal strain placed on institutions tasked with controlling technologies whose failure could annihilate entire regions. The earliest nuclear accidents occurred in an environment of improvisation, as weapons were developed and deployed faster than safety doctrine could mature, and early designs prioritized reliability and yield over accident resistance, reflecting the overriding fear that deterrence would fail if weapons could not be delivered under combat conditions. During this period, safety mechanisms were rudimentary, training uneven, and procedures still evolving, creating conditions in which accidents were treated as regrettable but tolerable costs of strategic necessity. Aircraft crashes carrying nuclear weapons, fires aboard bombers, mishandling during loading or maintenance, and losses at sea all occurred within a context where secrecy and reassurance were considered essential to maintaining public confidence and alliance stability. Broken arrow incidents thus rarely entered public consciousness at the time they occurred, managed instead through classified investigations and internal reforms that aimed to correct specific failures without challenging the broader system that produced them. As nuclear deployments expanded globally, the geographic scope of these accidents widened, occurring not only on U.S. territory, but in allied regions and remote environments, implicating foreign governments and civilian populations who often remained unaware of the risks they had been exposed to. This global dispersal underscored a fundamental tension of the Cold War nuclear order, that deterrence depended on placing weapons close to potential targets while simultaneously accepting the possibility that accidents could impose harm on those the system was meant to protect. Within the Pentagon, broken arrow incidents were treated as technical and procedural failures rather than strategic crises, reinforcing a compartmentalized approach in which accidents were isolated from questions about deterrence doctrine itself. Investigations focused on identifying proximate causes, such as equipment malfunction or deviation from procedure, while systemic issues, including the normalization of risk and the pressures of constant readiness, were addressed incrementally rather than through fundamental reconsideration. This approach reflected an institutional belief that nuclear danger could be managed through improved engineering and discipline, even as the accumulation of accidents suggested deeper vulnerabilities. The 1950s and early 1960s were particularly dense with such incidents, coinciding with the peak of airborne alert missions and rapid arsenal expansion, a period in which bombers carrying live nuclear weapons remained in the air around the clock to ensure survivability against surprise attack. These missions multiplied the probability of accident by extending exposure across time and space, turning routine flight operations into potential points of nuclear failure. Crashes and near crashes during this era revealed how close conventional accidents could come to producing nuclear catastrophe as safety mechanisms were tested under conditions never fully anticipated by designers. The absence of nuclear detonation in these cases was often the result of contingency rather than certainty, depending on the proper functioning of individual components or the fortuitous sequence of events, a reality acknowledged privately but rarely emphasized publicly. As the Cold War progressed, broken arrow incidents forced gradual adaptation, leading to improved weapon safety features, changes in deployment practices, and eventually the curtailment of some of the most hazardous operational routines. Yet these adaptations occurred unevenly, and often only after near disaster made risk undeniable. The classification of broken arrow itself became a tool for managing perception, allowing military authorities to signal internally that an accident had occurred while reassuring externally that the incident did not threaten immediate war, a linguistic containment that mirrored the broader strategy of managing nuclear risk through controlled narratives. The secrecy surrounding these incidents served multiple purposes, protecting sensitive information about weapon design and deployment, while also shielding political leaders from scrutiny over the everyday dangers imposed by deterrence. However, this secrecy carried its own costs as it delayed public reckoning with the true scale of nuclear risk and limited democratic oversight of policies that placed extraordinary hazards into routine practice. Broken arrow incidents also revealed the human dimension of nuclear deterrence, as service members operating under pressure became the final line of defense against catastrophe, their actions determining whether accidents escalated or were contained. Training, discipline, and organizational culture therefore played a critical role in shaping outcomes, underscoring that deterrence was sustained not only by abstract strategy, but by individual performance within complex systems. As more information about these incidents emerged through declassification decades later, they challenged simplified narratives of Cold War stability, revealing a parallel history in which survival depended on the avoidance of self-inflicted disaster, as much as on restraint between adversaries. Broken arrow incidents demonstrate that the Cold War nuclear order was characterized by persistent internal risk, managed through secrecy, redundancy, and incremental reform, rather than through fundamental redesign. They expose a structural paradox at the heart of deterrence, that weapons built to prevent war imposed continuous danger in peacetime, and that stability rested on the assumption that accidents would remain contained. In this sense, broken arrow incidents were not anomalies, but predictable byproducts of a system that demanded constant readiness and accepted extraordinary risk as the price of strategic credibility. Understanding this hidden history is essential to grasping how the Cold War was actually lived and managed, not as a static balance of terror, but as a continuous negotiation with failure, where catastrophe was avoided repeatedly, not through certainty, but through a fragile combination of engineering, procedure, and chance. As the number and diversity of broken arrow incidents accumulated across the Cold War, they exposed a recurring pattern in which the technical sophistication of nuclear forces outpaced the institutional capacity to manage their everyday hazards, forcing the Pentagon to confront the reality that deterrence was sustained through systems whose complexity made absolute control unattainable. Throughout the 1950s, a period of rapid expansion and doctrinal uncertainty, nuclear weapons were frequently involved in accidents that revealed how thin the margin was between routine operations and irreversible catastrophe, particularly in the context of airborne deployments where bombers carrying live weapons operated continuously over vast distances and under variable conditions. Aircraft crashes during training flights, takeoffs, and landings repeatedly tested weapon safety systems. And although nuclear detonations were avoided, investigations revealed that in several cases, conventional explosives within the weapons had armed or partially activated, demonstrating that safety mechanisms were not absolute barriers, but probabilistic defenses whose effectiveness depended on circumstance. These incidents forced internal reassessment of weapon design priorities, as engineers began to recognize that devices optimized solely for wartime reliability could exhibit dangerous behavior when subjected to accident stresses, such as fire, impact, or electrical disruption. The response was not immediate transformation, but gradual adaptation, as incremental improvements were introduced to reduce the likelihood that accidents could mimic combat conditions closely enough to trigger nuclear yield. However, during this period, operational practices continued largely unchanged, reflecting the overriding strategic imperative to maintain readiness in the face of perceived Soviet threat. Broken arrow incidents at sea further illustrated the breadth of risk, as nuclear weapons were lost during maritime operations, sinking into deep waters beyond recovery, an outcome that underscored how deterrence extended nuclear hazard into environments where remediation was impossible and accountability diffuse. The loss of weapons at sea raised difficult questions about long-term environmental contamination and strategic vulnerability. Yet these concerns were subordinated to secrecy and reassurance, reinforcing the pattern by which accidents were treated as discrete events rather than symptoms of systemic exposure. Within the military hierarchy, broken arrow investigations emphasized procedural compliance and individual responsibility, often framing accidents as deviations from established norms rather than as evidence that the norms themselves imposed unacceptable risk. This approach preserved institutional confidence while limiting the scope of reform, allowing deterrence doctrine to remain intact even as its operational consequences accumulated. By the early 1960s, the density of such incidents, combined with near misses that revealed how close some accidents had come to nuclear detonation, began to alter internal perceptions of acceptable risk, particularly as early warning failures and crisis instability highlighted how accidental outcomes could intersect with geopolitical tension. The convergence of these factors forced a reevaluation of some of the most hazardous practices, including continuous airborne alert missions, which multiplied exposure to accident across time and geography. Broken arrow incidents thus contributed indirectly to strategic shifts, as policymakers weighed the marginal deterrent value of constant readiness against the demonstrated risk of accidental catastrophe, a calculus shaped less by abstract theory than by accumulated evidence of failure narrowly avoided. The secrecy surrounding these incidents ensured that public debate lagged behind internal understanding, allowing reforms to proceed without confronting the broader question of whether the system itself was sustainable. Yet within classified circles, broken arrow incidents were increasingly recognized as indicators of structural vulnerability, revealing that the nuclear order depended not on infallible control, but on the assumption that accidents would remain non-nuclear through a combination of design, discipline, and fortune. This recognition influenced subsequent weapons development, as designers sought to incorporate stronger separation between safety and arming systems, reducing the likelihood that accidental stresses could produce catastrophic outcomes. Nevertheless, these improvements did not eliminate risk, as the fundamental requirement to deploy, transport, and maintain nuclear weapons ensured continued exposure to accident. Broken Arrow incidents therefore illuminate a critical dimension of Cold War history, showing how the pursuit of deterrence created a continuous background hazard managed through incremental adjustment rather than fundamental change, and how the avoidance of disaster depended on the persistent containment of failure within systems never designed to be fail-safe. As Broken Arrow incidents continued into the late Cold War, their cumulative effect was to erode any remaining illusion that nuclear danger could be confined to moments of deliberate confrontation, revealing instead a persistent background risk generated by the routine operation of deterrence itself, a risk that institutions learned to live with rather than eliminate. By the late 1970s and 1980s, the United States managed an arsenal that was safer by design than its early Cold War predecessor, yet more complex, aging, and distributed across a wider range of platforms and facilities, creating new vectors for accident, even as older ones were mitigated. Missile systems replaced bombers as the backbone of deterrence, reducing exposure to aviation accidents, but introducing hazards associated with silo maintenance, fuel handling, and command and control integration, hazards that would later be exposed dramatically by incidents such as Damascus, underscoring that risk migrated rather than disappeared. Naval deployments, particularly ballistic missile submarines, reduced the visibility of nuclear weapons, but extended the consequences of accident into environments where recovery and transparency were virtually impossible, reinforcing the reality that Broken Arrow incidents could impose permanent uncertainty rather than discrete resolution. The persistence of these incidents shaped a quiet fatalism within nuclear institutions, an acceptance that absolute safety was unattainable and that deterrence depended on managing probabilities rather than guaranteeing outcomes. A posture reflected in the language of reports that emphasized reduced likelihood rather than elimination of risk. This probabilistic framing allowed deterrence doctrine to coexist with acknowledged vulnerability, preserving strategic confidence while normalizing the idea that catastrophe was avoided through margins rather than certainties. Broken Arrow incidents also influenced how nuclear accidents were integrated into strategic planning, as war games and simulations increasingly accounted for internal failure modes alongside enemy action. Recognizing that escalation dynamics could be driven by accident as well as intent. This recognition complicated crisis management as leaders confronted scenarios in which ambiguous events required rapid interpretation under conditions of incomplete information, increasing the importance of communication, verification, and restraint. Yet even as planners acknowledged these dangers, secrecy remained central, ensuring that public understanding of nuclear risk lagged far behind internal assessment, and that democratic oversight remained limited. The declassification of Broken Arrow incidents decades later revealed how extensively accidents had shaped Cold War practice, challenging narratives that portrayed deterrence as a stable balance, maintained through rational calculation alone. Instead, these revelations exposed a system sustained through continuous correction, where failure was anticipated, absorbed, and contained without ever being fully confronted. Broken Arrow incidents thus serve as a lens through which to reinterpret Cold War stability, not as an equilibrium free from danger, but as a condition maintained through constant effort to prevent internal breakdown. They demonstrate that the avoidance of nuclear war depended not only on superpower restraint, but on the daily performance of institutions and individuals operating under extraordinary pressure, whose success was measured not by achievement, but by the absence of disaster. The fact that nuclear detonations did not occur during these accidents does not negate their significance, as it was often the product of contingent factors rather than robust design, highlighting how close deterrence came to self-inflicted catastrophe. In this sense, Broken Arrow incidents underscore the fragility of the nuclear age, revealing that stability was never guaranteed but repeatedly earned through vigilance, adaptation, and, at times, sheer fortune. As the Cold War ended, the legacy of these incidents persisted within institutional memory, shaping attitudes towards safety, transparency, and risk management in a world that remained nuclear even as bipolar confrontation dissolved. They remind us that the Cold War's most dangerous moments were not always those marked by crisis and rhetoric, but those embedded in routine operations, where extraordinary power intersected with ordinary fallibility. Broken Arrow incidents therefore occupy a central place in understanding the true nature of Cold War deterrence, exposing a system that survived not because it was safe, but because it continually contained its own failures, deferring catastrophe through incremental learning rather than fundamental transformation. As the Cold War drew toward its conclusion, the historical significance of Broken Arrow incidents became clearer not as isolated mishaps, but as structural features of a nuclear order that had normalized extraordinary danger within everyday military practice, revealing how deterrence survived through continual accommodation to failure rather than through its elimination. The end of superpower confrontation did not retroactively render these accidents anomalous, but instead exposed how deeply nuclear risk had been embedded in routine operations across decades, sustained by secrecy, institutional confidence, and the belief that catastrophe could be perpetually deferred. Within defense establishments, the accumulated record of Broken Arrow incidents informed a more sober understanding of nuclear stewardship, reinforcing the view that safety was an ongoing process rather than a fixed achievement, and that vigilance could not be relaxed without inviting failure. This understanding shaped post-Cold War reforms, as the reduction of arsenals and changes in deployment practices were influenced in part by recognition that fewer weapons and less frequent handling reduced the probability of accident, even if they did not eliminate nuclear danger altogether. The legacy of Broken Arrow incidents thus extended beyond the Cold War itself, informing how nuclear risk was conceptualized in an era of diminished rivalry but persistent arsenals. Analytically, these incidents challenge simplified interpretations of Cold War stability by demonstrating that the absence of nuclear war was not proof of system reliability, but evidence of continual, often unseen effort to prevent internal collapse. They reveal that deterrence functioned through a constant tension between readiness and safety, a tension managed pragmatically rather than resolved, and that institutional success was measured by the absence of disaster rather than the presence of control. Broken Arrow incidents also complicate narratives of technological mastery, showing that advances in engineering reduced but did not remove vulnerability, and that new systems introduced new failure modes even as they mitigated old ones. This dynamic underscores a central lesson of the nuclear age, that complexity itself generates risk, and that systems designed to operate under extreme conditions are inherently prone to unexpected interaction and failure. The human dimension of these incidents remains central to their meaning, as they underscore the reliance of nuclear stability on individual performance under pressure, on crews responding to fires, crashes, leaks, and alarms whose outcomes depended on discipline, judgment, and chance. These individuals operated within structures that accepted risk as unavoidable, placing extraordinary responsibility on human action as the final barrier against catastrophe. The secrecy surrounding broken arrow incidents delayed public understanding of this reality, allowing myths of infallibility to persist, even as internal assessments acknowledged vulnerability, a divide that shaped public discourse and limited democratic engagement with nuclear policy. When information eventually emerged, it reframed Cold War history by revealing how close routine operations had come to irreversible disaster, challenging the assumption that stability was the natural outcome of deterrence rather than its most fragile achievement. In this sense, broken arrow incidents force a reconsideration of what it meant for the Cold War to end without nuclear war, suggesting that survival owed as much to containment of internal failure as to restraint between adversaries. They highlight that the nuclear age was characterized not only by ideological rivalry, but by a persistent struggle to manage technologies whose destructive capacity exceeded the margin for error available to human institutions. As historical evidence accumulates, broken arrow incidents stand as reminders that deterrence was never a closed system, but an ongoing experiment in risk management conducted under conditions of uncertainty and pressure. Their cumulative history reveals a Cold War defined by narrow escapes as much as by deliberate calculation, and by the constant effort to prevent catastrophe arising from within as much as from without. Understanding this hidden dimension is essential to any serious assessment of Cold War strategy, as it exposes the everyday fragility beneath narratives of balance and control. Broken arrow incidents thus occupy a central place in the history of nuclear deterrence, not as footnotes or curiosities, but as evidence that the nuclear peace was sustained through vigilance, adaptation, and contingency rather than certainty, and that the avoidance of disaster depended on the continual containment of failure within systems never designed to be fail-safe. As the record of broken arrow incidents is viewed in its entirety, it becomes evident that their greatest significance lies not in any single accident, but in the cumulative revelation that nuclear deterrence functioned as a system permanently operating at the edge of its own failure, sustained through an uneasy balance of engineering, discipline, and luck rather than through assured control. These incidents demonstrate that the Cold War nuclear order depended on a continuous process of error detection and containment, in which accidents were absorbed, investigated, and quietly corrected, without ever prompting a comprehensive reassessment of the premises that made them inevitable. Within this framework, the absence of nuclear detonation during broken arrow events was not proof of safety, but evidence that catastrophe was repeatedly deferred by narrow margins, margins defined by the performance of individual components, the judgment of personnel, and circumstances that could easily have unfolded differently. This reality undermines narratives that portray deterrence as a stable equilibrium achieved through rational planning alone, revealing, instead, a system whose stability was contingent and provisional, maintained through constant vigilance against internal breakdown. The normalization of such risk was made possible by secrecy, which insulated decision-makers from public accountability and allowed institutions to treat accidents as technical anomalies rather than as indicators of systemic fragility. This insulation shaped how broken arrow incidents were understood internally, emphasizing corrective action and confidence restoration, while limiting discussion of broader implications for deterrence doctrine. Yet within classified circles, the accumulation of accidents fostered a sober awareness that nuclear danger was omnipresent, informing a professional culture that viewed safety as an ongoing struggle rather than a solved problem. The gradual reduction of the most accident-prone practices, such as continuous airborne alert, reflects how broken arrow incidents influenced policy indirectly, shaping behavior through evidence rather than through explicit debate. Technological improvements in weapon safety, though significant, did not eliminate the fundamental hazard created by the need to deploy, transport, and maintain nuclear weapons, ensuring that broken arrow incidents remained possible even as their probability was reduced. This persistence highlights a central paradox of the nuclear age, that measures taken to enhance deterrence credibility simultaneously generate new risks, forcing constant trade-offs between readiness and safety. The human element remains central to this history, as broken arrow incidents underscore the dependence of nuclear stability on individuals operating under stress, whose actions often determined whether accidents escalated or were contained. These individuals functioned within organizational structures that accepted risk as unavoidable, placing extraordinary responsibility on human performance as the final barrier against catastrophe. In historical perspective, broken arrow incidents reveal a Cold War lived not only in crises and confrontations, but in routine operations where extraordinary power intersected with ordinary fallibility. They show that the survival of the nuclear age was not the inevitable outcome of strategic wisdom, but the product of continuous effort to manage systems that could fail catastrophically without warning. As the Cold War ended, the legacy of these incidents persisted as a cautionary record of how close deterrence came to self-destruction, informing post-war debates about arsenal reduction, safety culture, and transparency. They remind us that the most dangerous aspects of the Cold War were often invisible at the time, embedded in classified procedures and near misses, rather than in publicized standoffs. Broken arrow incidents thus stand as a testament to the fragility of nuclear deterrence, illustrating that the absence of nuclear war was achieved not through invulnerability, but through the repeated containment of failure, a fragile achievement dependent on systems and people operating under relentless pressure. In this final accounting, the history of broken arrow incidents exposes a Cold War defined as much by internal hazard as by external rivalry, revealing that the nuclear peace was sustained through constant negotiation with risk, and that its endurance was contingent, uncertain, and far more precarious than official assurances ever suggested. In its final historical balance, the Cold War record of broken arrow incidents exposes a dimension of nuclear history that stands in stark contrast to public narratives of stability and control, revealing that deterrence endured not because it was inherently safe, but because its failures were repeatedly contained before they crossed an irreversible threshold. These accidents demonstrate that the nuclear age was characterized by a persistent background danger generated by routine operations, a danger managed through secrecy, procedurals, discipline, and incremental adaptation rather than eliminated through design or doctrine. Broken arrow incidents show that the absence of nuclear war was not the natural outcome of rational strategy, but the cumulative result of countless moments in which catastrophe was narrowly avoided through a combination of engineering safeguards, human judgment, and circumstance. They reveal that the Cold War's most perilous threats were often internal, arising from the everyday handling, transport, and maintenance of weapons whose destructive power exceeded the margin for error available to human institutions. This hidden history challenges the idea that nuclear deterrence functioned as a closed and stable system, instead exposing it as an ongoing experiment in risk management conducted under conditions of uncertainty, pressure, and incomplete control. The gradual reforms prompted by broken arrow incidents, from improved weapon safety features to changes in deployment practices, illustrate how learning followed failure rather than anticipation, reinforcing a strategic culture that tolerated danger until evidence made it undeniable. Yet even these reforms did not resolve the underlying paradox, that maintaining deterrence required continuous exposure to accident, ensuring that risk could be reduced but never eliminated. The secrecy surrounding Broken Arrow incidents allowed deterrence doctrine to persist without public scrutiny, but it also delayed broader recognition of how fragile nuclear stability truly was, revealing a divide between internal awareness and external reassurance that shaped Cold War governance. As information emerged decades later, these incidents reframed the historical understanding of the Cold War, highlighting that survival depended not only on restraint between adversaries, but on the constant containment of self-inflicted danger. Broken Arrow incidents therefore occupy a central place in understanding the nuclear age, not as marginal footnotes, but as evidence that the Cold War was sustained through vigilance against internal failure, as much as through balance against external threat. They demonstrate that nuclear peace was not guaranteed by strategy alone, but achieved through continuous effort to prevent systems built for destruction from destroying themselves. In this sense, the history of Broken Arrow incidents reveals a Cold War defined by narrow margins and persistent hazard, where the line between routine operation and irreversible catastrophe was thinner than official narratives ever allowed, and where the endurance of deterrence rested on a fragile equilibrium maintained through adaptation, discipline, and the repeated deferral of disaster rather than through assured control.